Great, thank you. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Fran Ludwig. And Fran is a senior assistant teacher with the Greater Boston Zen Center and the practice leader for the Mustard Seed Sitting Group in Middletown, Connecticut. Fran has a background in environmental science and a long history of advocacy for mental health services. I also want to acknowledge with much appreciation Mary Downing, an assistant teacher with the Greater Boston Zen Center and Zen Down East, and a music educator for 40 years. We have had the pleasure of listening to Mary's playing before every class. And tonight, she's going to open tonight's class playing Dvorak on clarinet. Thank you, Fran and Mary.
Thank you, Diane. Welcome, everyone. Just one correction. We'll be hearing from Mary a little later in the program, but not immediately. But I'd like to begin by thanking Mary. She has been my co-collaborator on developing this presentation. We've worked closely together on it. I'll be doing the majority of the presentation tonight, but you will have a chance to hear Mary play her clarinet a little later on in the program. The other person that I'd like to acknowledge is a woman named Joanna Macy, who many of you may be familiar with. She is a longtime environmental activist and a Buddhist scholar, also has a PhD in systems theory. And she is author of 8 books. She began her work in the 1970s around the nuclear arms race. And then as the environmental crisis became more and more prominent, she shifted her work in that direction. And she has become a pioneer in developing a framework for how we meet these personal and social challenges of our time. She's well known for holding workshops internationally and helping people learn how to deal with these sorts of major crises. And even at 91, which she is now, she's still busy with her work. She did a workshop for 1,000 people on Zoom in April about the pandemic. So the work that, the information that we'll be talking about tonight is based on Joanna's work. And the centerpiece of that work is something that she calls the spiral that reconnects. And this reconnection is to our intimate relationships with each other and with the world. And this spiral starts down here with the root of this flower, with gratitude. And gratitude arises from a sense of wonder and appreciation for life. And it strengthens our capacity for the next step, which is honoring our pain. This is the part of this spiral that we'll be focusing on tonight. When we're able to experience our pain for something that's beyond our immediate self-interest, what we discover is compassion and connection to the world around us. And that is what allows us to see with new eyes. So we see with eyes that recognize our, that we're part of a much larger story. And when we recognize that, we're able to go forth in the world and find our roles, find our role and our unique gifts in how we address what's before us. So just a little framing for what we'll be doing tonight. The first 3 presentations in this series were really factually based, a lot of facts and information for us to consider, and primarily used our brains. What we're going to be doing today is going to move us a little more out of our heads and into our hearts. So we're going to start today with just trying to create a framework for how we approach this work and manage difficult emotions, and talking about how we really approach this world that's on fire. And then later in the program, we're going to have a chance to actually befriend these difficult emotions that some of us are experiencing. So we've had a lot of opportunity in the earlier presentations to confront the reality that that we're facing. But I like this image because I feel like it's a really good visual and emotional representation of what it feels like right now. It can feel like we are really swimming in a sea of danger. And in this environment, anxiety and fear are healthy responses. As humans, we come with a built-in internal alarm that alerts us to danger. And so if we see a child dash in front of traffic, we immediately rush in and pull the child to safety. If the wood stove catches on fire, we grab a fire extinguisher. So we are designed to respond to threats. And the adrenaline that can rise up is part of that response. The way this works is something happens and we stray off course. And then if we're paying attention, we might notice that there's a threat. And when we identify the threat, we're able to respond and get back on course. And this is called a negative feedback loop. And it's very important because it connects our perception of a threat to our action. And it helps us produce an appropriate response. For example, maybe I notice the smell of smoke. And then I realize that I have left the burner on the stove and the rice is burning. And so I respond by rushing to the stove, removing the rice, and turning off the burner. If we think about this in terms of what's going on in the world today, we might notice that we're having more intense storms, we're having more fires, we're having more severe weather events. And then when we look into it, we notice that carbon dioxide levels are increasing in the atmosphere. And when we can identify that, then we can respond by taking steps to reduce emissions that are producing that carbon dioxide. Sometimes these negative feedback loops fail. Either we stray off course and we never realize we've done it, so we never realize there's a threat. So we might be hiking on a trail, not notice that we've wandered off until we fall into the bear pit. So there's never a chance for an appropriate response. But sometimes we actually identify the threat, but we fail to respond. So what happens between this threat and the response? We feel some kind of pain. So if we put our hand on the stove, it feels hot. We immediately remove our hand. So that's some pain. It might be emotional pain. If we see a police officer with his knee on the neck of a person of color, we get angry and then respond by going to the streets to protest. Or we might identify a threat of a deadly virus and we are afraid. And so we respond to that fear by putting on a mask and staying away from, keeping our distance from other people. But sometimes we feel the pain and we don't respond. There's a story of researchers who had volunteer subjects, and they put them in a room and gave them a questionnaire to fill out and closed the door. And shortly after they closed the door, this smoky vapor started coming in through the vent in the room. If a subject was in the room by themselves, they immediately ran out of the room. But if there were other people in the room with them, other subjects, they would look around and see what other people were doing and not leave immediately until other people did. And in one case, they sat there for 6 minutes until the researchers had to come in and rescue them because the room was completely full of smoke. So some of the reasons that we fail to respond are what have been called cognitive biases. And these are generally things that we're not aware of. They're subconscious. They're behaviors that we engage in, but we're not really aware of it. So the example of the subjects and the smoke in the room is the bandwagon effect. So we just don't want to look different. We want to do what other people are doing. We don't want to stand out. So we don't respond. Sometimes it's what's called the bystander effect, when we think someone else will take care of it, so I don't need to deal with it. We're very familiar with the ostrich effect with climate change, and that is, I'm just going to deny it, it's a problem. So all of us know people who suffer from this bias. There's an automation bias where we just tell ourselves that technology will take care of it. So some technology will come along to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then we can just return to business as usual. Or if there's a drought in parts of Africa, we'll seed the clouds and make it rain there, and our problems will be solved. One that I'm guilty of is called confirmation bias, where we look for evidence for what we already think is true. So if we read an article that agrees with our predetermined ideas, we'll believe it's true. Otherwise, we'll dismiss it. And here are a few more. One is called a status quo bias, business as usual. You know, if the information is inconvenient and threatens my financial interest or my political interests, and I don't want to upset the apple cart, then I want things to stay as they are. I'll ignore the threat. We might have an optimism bias and think everything will be fine. We're Pollyannas. Don't worry your little head, that'll turn out okay. Or the opposite, we've already passed the tipping point. It's not going to make any difference. We might as well just throw up our hands and give up. Another thing that happens, I'm not sure this is actually called a cognitive bias, but it's cognitive overload. We are just bombarded with information. And there's just one heartbreaking story after another in the news about things going on in the world. And it can be just too much, and we get overwhelmed and just become paralyzed. So we can't respond at all. And then the last one is overwhelm, where it is just too upsetting to think about. We just avoid confronting it because it's too painful. And one thing that happens when we're overwhelmed is we distract ourselves. And there are whole industries that have built up to help us do that, beginning with the pharmaceutical industry. There's a pill for anything that bothers us. The entertainment industry has been very helpful in this regard, with ways for us to distract ourselves. Shopping is another way that we do that. We get lost in our devices, and sometimes we just get lost in our work and are subject of being overworked. So the result of all of this, all of these ways that we avoid our pain for whatever reason, is apathy. And I'm intrigued by this word because apathy comes from this Greek root apatheia, which means non-suffering. The inability or refusal to experience pain. So this is what is necessary for us to get from the threat to the response, is a willingness to experience pain. But if we're apathetic, we're not going to permit ourselves to do that. And so blocking the pain inhibits our ability to respond. Unblocking occurs when our pain for the world is not only acknowledged, but experienced. So intellectual awareness by itself isn't enough. We have to give ourselves permission to actually feel and metabolize our anxiety, our fear, our sadness, our hopelessness, our grief, whatever is coming up that we're trying to avoid. Thomas Merton said, "The truth that many people never understand until it's too late is that the more you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer." So we don't often think about this. It takes a lot of energy for us to hold on to these emotions. If we take just a minute right now to notice in our bodies, we can sense these little places where there are contractions. And these are places where we are trying to hold on to emotions rather than experience them. So when we allow ourselves to metabolize these emotions, it releases that energy that we're using to hold on to them and makes that energy available for other things, like being able to respond. And paradoxically, facing these painful feelings can actually leave us energized and nourished by the experience. And it can make us feel more alive. It can feel like a weight's been lifted. So if we want to be at full strength to meet the crises that are facing us, we have to confront our anxiety or fear or desperation or whatever we're feeling. So what if doing that just feels too scary? What if it feels like if we open to our pain, it'll be a bottomless pit that we'll never be able to get out of? It's important to remember that grief is a natural human process, a natural human response to loss. It's not a pathology or a problem to be fixed. Grief isn't inherently debilitating or overwhelming or chronic. Most of us show a natural resilience to grief. Following the initial crisis of the loss, most people are able to move through their grief while maintaining a healthy level of functioning. And one of the gifts of our grief is that when we turn towards our grief, we discover something surprising. And that's love. Our grief is a function of love. The reason we grieve is because we love, because we feel deeply connected. And the deeper our grief, the deeper the love. So our grief is visible, tangible evidence that we care about something beyond ourselves. We feel distress when other beings suffer because at a deep level, we are not separate from them. We're all interconnected. So we're not closed off from the world, but we're integral components of it. So imagine that we're cells in one large body. If I fall and break my leg, it's not that just that bone is going to be traumatized, but everything else in my body will be traumatized too. My heart, my brain, my bones will start churning out white blood cells and platelets and clotting factor to help heal that wound. And the body comes together and all the parts work on healing that trauma. So imagine the one body is the world, and we are parts of it. If one part of the body is traumatized, we feel that. So our pain for the world is the price of consciousness. It's not only natural, but it's a necessary component of our collective healing. John Seed, who was an environmentalist, who actually worked with Joanna Macy early in her career, said, "I am part of the rainforest protecting myself. I am that part of the rainforest recently emerged into thinking." So, what if our hearts break open? The heart that breaks open can hold the whole universe. We find that when our hearts break open, we're able to hold all of life's experience. Not just what's good and happy and joyful, but also what's difficult and painful. In opening to our suffering, we also open to more love and compassion. Jesus said, "Blessed are they who mourn." And I like to think this is why. Because those who know how to mourn can hold it all. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now. And we're going to take a little time to practice inviting our pain for the world to come forward in whatever form it arises. We're going to do this with a guided meditation. And as we do this, invite whatever is feeling heavy or challenging or difficult to come forward. And this might be fear or anxiety, sadness, might be despair, guilt, hopelessness. What arises might be blankness or numbness. So if that's what happens, that's also part of the world. We can be with that as well. If what comes up for you is loss or pain from your own life, that's okay too. That's an important part of our grief for the world and arises within it. And if what you notice is resistance to doing this exercise at all, then just notice that too. So music is a powerful language for our emotions. And Mary is going to open this meditation with some music from Dvorak that can speak to our hearts. So closing our eyes, focusing on our breath. There's no need to breathe in any special way, slow or long. Just watching the breathing as it naturally happens. In and out. And as we watch our breathing, we can notice that it happens all by itself, without any interference from us. Without our deciding when to inhale or exhale. It's as though we're being breathed. Breathed by life. And just with each of us, every sentient being on this planet is being breathed by life. Now let's let this breath flow into our hearts. And breathing through our hearts, let this breath connect to the larger web of life, creating a continuous loop. This breath of life passing through each of us, out into all things, and then back through our hearts. Now opening our awareness to the suffering world. Letting images come as concretely as we can. Images of those who are sick, who are traumatized, who are living in fear or isolation. Refugees from violence, hunger, poverty. A planet sick from pollution and exploitation. There's no need to strain for these images. Just notice what's naturally arising for you. And if more than one thing is coming up, see what most wants your company. And now breathing this pain through your heart, letting it flow out again, surrendering it to the universe, which holds all things. When we allow ourselves to feel the pain of the world is feeling through us. And if you're afraid that with this pain your heart might break, just remember, the heart that breaks open can hold the whole universe. Your heart is that large. Just trust it. Keep breathing. And now coming back to the breath. And when you feel ready, opening your eyes. So giving voice to our concerns helps us bring them into the open. And when we allow our feelings to move through us, we're less likely to get stuck in them. It's part of the healing process. So by speaking our feelings and giving voice to them, we make them more visible, not only to ourselves, but to others. So what we're going to do right now is just keeping ourselves on mute. We're going to invite everyone to just speak what's in your heart. Just speak it out loud. To our emotions when we fully meet them. And they can be transformed. So our fear and our dread can be transformed into courage and trust. Our anger and our outrage can become a passion for justice. Our inadequacy and powerlessness can create a space for something new to arise. And our sorrow and grief creates an opening to love. So returning to Joanna's spiral, the upcoming presentations are going to help us see with new eyes. Next week, Newell Louie, who is an Indigenous American, is going to talk to us about longstanding traditions in the Indigenous American community that honor our deep connections to the world around us. And then there'll be several other presentations after that that address how we go forth in the world with these open hearts. How do we channel this newly released energy that we experience, and how do we convert that into conscious action? So, Leslie, if there are any questions, we can take those now.
So Fran, I think that's about it. I don't see any other questions in the chat other than what John Burke put in there. I did put your email address in there. So if people have things that come up, even in the aftermath, they could always reach out to you by email. But it looks like that you've covered it all. You've done a great job.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining today. Appreciate your interest in this work on eco-anxiety and the pandemic. So hope to see you next week.
And I know everyone joins me in thanking you, Fran, and thanking you, Mary, for a wonderful and touching presentation that helped us make the turn into this new progression from the reality that we're confronting to moving into our experience of it, and then as we go along, moving into action. And I really loved how you helped me to see that grief is not inherently debilitating, that it really can be the springboard for the measure of our love for the world and the springboard for acting. And thank you, Mary, for the beautiful music. It just reminded me of the evanescent quality of this earth that we all so love. So thank you both, and for everyone else, thank you once again for showing up. And we will, and Leslie is now sharing this final screen with information. And you will see there's a note there that on the recordings page, which you can access via the email that was sent to you for tonight's class, there's a link to the recordings page. You will find there Fran's PowerPoint, as well as a number of additional resources if you'd like to explore this topic and Joanna Macy's work further. As Fran said, I hope you will join us for next week's presentation by Newell Louie, the Passamaquoddy Language and Culture Manager for Wabanaki Public Health. I'm really looking forward to his presentation and hearing his valuable perspective. Thank you, everyone, once again, and we'll leave the screen up for a bit if you want to take down the information. But Thank you, and everyone stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you.